I wanted to ask you, if I could, about when you were blacklisted.
Yeah.
If that was the case.
Yeah.
And as it's very rare to meet anyone nowadays who was...
How do I look?
How do you look?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Because it's very rare to meet anyone.
That's all that's important.
That's all that's important. What was because for most people now, it's because it sort of goes in the category of McCarthyism. It's something that's black and white. It was the 50s.
Well, it was.
But at the time, it was something very real.
Very real.
And how was it to go through that experience?
Well, it was my education, and it was also my trauma. And I carry both the scars and the best things about it with me for the rest of my days. I had just made Detective Story, the film Detective Story. And that was my first job. And I was maybe 20 then. And I had fallen in love with a writer who was blacklisted and who was named as a communist. And because of that, by the time Detective Story came out, I could no longer work in film or in television for 12 years. So there went my 20s. And so in that time, being a very kind of Riverside Drive-y bourgeois girl who had never read a newspaper, I became a very, very empowered activist. And that has stayed with me for the rest of my life. I'm very involved. And it wasn't until 12 years later that I was released and told that I could go back to work. And that only happened because the lawyer who was handling it for me, who was a very important person in Washington, was asked by the Un-American Activities Committee, by somebody there, to do him a favor. And as a joke, he said, well, okay, I'll do that for you. You let Lee Grant off. And he said, okay. But for those 12 years, unless I named my husband, I couldn't work. Those were the conditions. Because they didn't have me on anything else.
Was there a sense of embarrassment from among other people at the time? Fear?
Fear.
Fear.
Fear. Fear. I mean, fear. Of course. I mean, you know, your actions didn't have to be on a barricade to lose your job. You just had to sign one of my petitions because, you know, I'd go around and ask people to sign petitions for this, petitions for that. By the signing of those petitions, I don't think it didn't affect me later when I thought about my getting people's names on a petition and that could keep them from working. But raising your hand in the union, the TV union, our TV union, was the source of all the blacklisting in television. The board of AFTRA, which was the television union, was made up of people who blacklisted anybody who stood up and talked in the membership. And there were thousands who attended that. They even invited the professional blacklisters to be a part of the board in order to pick out the people that they wanted. So our fight through those 10 years was to get that board out of AFTRA and get in somebody who was real. You know, not necessarily left, but just real. And it was a bizarre nightmare.
you feel that today peace has been made with that time, or no apology was ever made? Has an apology ever been made?
No.
It's just gone under the radar for a bit.
Apology by whom? Apology by whom? It was, actors in a superior position who believed that there was a communist threat, and that actors who spoke for political freedom were dangerous and shouldn't work. Now, the theater never had the blacklist. All of us who worked on Broadway, because there was no off-Broadway then, always worked on Broadway. We couldn't work in film or television. So by the time Detective Story came out, which was my first film, and I had been nominated for an Academy Award, and I had won the Cannes Film Festival Award for Best Actress, which is just ridiculous for that little part, I couldn't work anyplace in the industry. If you said you were not going to name names, you really accepted the fact that you were not going to work for the rest of your life. And that's why a lot of people who named names did so, because they thought they were not going to work for the rest of their life. And so were very shamed, as Kazan was, when the blacklist period was over and we all went back to work, and he was left having made sure that other people would not work. And then, of course, the Nixon period, and then this period, the Bush period, where suddenly we find ourselves in somebody's pit, being lied to and having wars that were based on lies, and the kind of laws that are being enacted now that our forefathers came to America to run away against, which was habeas corpus, and which was against torture and against a kind of inquisition. And we are putting those things into law now under the Bush administration. And the things that are happening each day, and I know I don't just feel about it, I know you all feel about it, is what more terrible and bizarre thing can happen than is happening around the world now? And so what I hope and pray is that, having lived through two horrible times in our history, that maybe with the work of good people and with voting the proper way, and with maybe they're having voting machines which are not fixed against us, that maybe we may come out of this, and that my children and grandchildren will find a better world than I brought them into.